Hi, welcome to this session, and we'll focus on the nature of research. We'll look at the definition, purpose, and classifications of research. Objectives. We aim to define research as a concept, understand the key features or characteristics of research, explain why we do research, and then discuss the classifications or types of research. Uh, by research, research has towards in itself. So we have a prefix of re, and then we have search. A combination of those two would equate to search for knowledge. So re means again and over again, which means that something has been searched about, and therefore more uh, search is being done. And by such, we mean a careful investigation or examination or probing or checking or testing something. It could be an event, a situation, uh, or any other case. So, by definition of research, we're talking about careful investigation, inquiring about something to gather new facts or knowledge. And such a process is always organized, planned, and it is objective because it is purposed or focused on defining a certain problem and finding a solution. Well, there are various definitions, but we have common characteristics that can give us general idea of what research is. And Islam, on the other, has looked at it as an enterprise of knowledge construction or knowledge production or manufacturing of knowledge, if you will. Um, uh, so it has to do with linking what has been done uh, before through other studies, maybe, and then the research is done again in the present or uh, uh, to determine what is currently happening in the present or what may happen in the future. To generate that particular knowledge. So it's systematic in a way that it is organized to either validate or refine the knowledge that has been generated before or generating new knowledge, especially in cases where no studies or no literature does not exist, or if there is limited literature, as we shall see. So, but of course, because monitoring and evaluation belong as a discipline belongs to especially humanities yeah, and social sciences, uh, we look at the general category of social research, and social research draws on theoretical and conceptual ideas and academic traditions of social sciences, and therefore the whole research process is mainly motivated and influenced by societal developments and the changes that are happening in societies. The changes could be negative or positive, and research in that case is done to understand those social changes to be able to have ideas on how to move along with such changes or to address the negative changes to find solutions. So since monitoring and evaluation is in general looks at assessing processes and discovering solutions to certain problems through either interventions such as projects or policies or programs. Yeah, so the process of monitoring and evaluation adopt same methodological aspects of research in general. So there are key features or characteristics of research that can help us conceptualize what research is. Research is motivated and guided by question, or in other cases, hypothesis or problem. And therefore, after defining a question or setting a hypothesis, or defining a problem, then research can be conducted to generate knowledge about such a question, to answer such a question, or find a solution of a certain problem. It has research has clear goals and there are objectives that must be achieved. So there has to be at least an outcome or a product of research, and usually a product or outcome is um, could be just knowledge, or that knowledge can be used to uh, create new solutions in terms of products, or tools or instruments. Uh, it involves specific planned procedures, usually following scientific methods of inquiry, and it's those scientific methods of inquiry that we can use to collect and interpret the data needed to generate that particular knowledge that we are interested in. So the process can be continuous or iterative in a way, or cyclical in a way that yeah, you define a problem, or design a question, do research, collect data, interpret, and then get findings. And those findings can address the idea that if you want to continue again finding, determining further information regarding aspects of the data that you have interpreted, that's what makes it cyclic, because there is always a continuous process of trying to find new things about what we have already established. And uh, it should be able to provide certain information that can be generalized or contextualized in certain settings. Uh, that can be used for learning purposes, or for solving certain problems and answering certain questions. Those could be the key uh, uh, aspects or characteristics of research. So one may ask, then why do we do research? One, it is done to fill gaps in literature, meaning that studies on certain knowledge has been created and there is information that we can find, but within that information, there are some gaps of things that we have not found out, um, in terms of knowledge and in terms of solutions. And therefore, research is done to close such gaps. It is also done to examine and understand new developments in society. Like I said earlier, the changes could be positive or negative, and therefore, the idea is try to understand such societal development and how people can live along with such new developments. Um, Also, it could be done to assess and resolve problems to find those solutions. For instance, in medicine, there could be a new disease, and they have to develop medicine, come up with medicine or treatment and curative solutions. Could be a vaccine, and therefore, that's why such research is done. We also want to create or validate knowledge in terms of credibility, see whether it is reliable or not. And the whole idea is to make the data to make information factual enough. Okay, so by making it factual, it means that we have to get information that can support such facts, or in other cases disprove information that is untested. For instance, you could have conspiracy theories about a certain event, and such conspiracies are coming from misinformation, and research can be done to either approve or disapprove such information. And of course, at the end of the day, the information from research is used to make decisions for betterment. Now, we have different categories of research or types of research, and the classification of such types is based on several uh, aspects or components. Mm. And the research could be classified based on the goal or the outcome or the intentions of what needs to be produced, or it could be classified based on purpose of research, approach and level of investigation, or research design, or the choice of answers to certain problems, or the methods and processes of inquiry, or the type of data that is used, or field of study, or time. There are other categories, of course, but for now, let's focus on this. So we'll talk about these, the different categories based on this classification in a moment. So if we begin with the classification based on goal, we could have three categories here. One is the basic, pure, or also known as fundamental research. This is driven by scientific curiosity or scientific questions that focus on expanding or creating knowledge. For instance, this could relate to, for instance, what the NASA is doing. For instance, traveling to space to do more research and finding out about the universe and our galaxy or or other planets. It could be studying, I mean, related to genetics or electronics and so on. So that could relate to, for instance, more scientific discoveries. We also have applied research, which focuses on solving particular problem practically. Okay, so could be that, for instance, uh, they are looking at treating a certain disease, and this requires practical um, application of certain methods to find solutions. Uh, and the practicability could also be within social settings that certain interventions are applied. Um, so we also have action research under this classification by Gore. Sometimes also this could be categorized as in terms of scope, and this focuses on immediate, or for instance, you could say here and now application of scientific methods to solve specific problems. So this also action research relates to applied research. Um, so, but yeah, for action, it's implementation, and then the results are verified there, and then new methods are also applied to see that they get better solutions as necessary. When it comes to classification by purpose, approach, and level of investigation, we have several types of research. One of them is descriptive, which looks at describing or interpreting or portraying aspects of a certain phenomenon or event. And in this case, this focuses on something that can be studied or counted, and can be done there and then to describe whatever is happening in the present, and usually sometimes follows the use of surveys. That's why others would look at it related to statistical research. We have exploratory research, which is usually done when there is no knowledge known about a certain case or event, or um, uh, few studies uh, have been done, um, and therefore more information is needed. So this would therefore entail some kind of in-depth, detailed uh, study to understand problems that have not been clearly defined. And this may rely more on qualitative and secondary data to get that information, which then other uh, other researchers can rely on, such as explanatory um, and descriptive. So uh, in explanatory, we do research to know, for instance, to explain and know why certain events are happening, and this also builds on, for instance, exploratory and descriptive researches, trying to discover and measuring causal relations. So causal relations, in this case, for instance, you could ask whether, for instance, income actually uh, causes one to uh, whether increase in income influences one to buy a car. Okay. So if that can be tested and measured, then you could say, okay, for instance, you could explain that if one gets increases income, then there's a likelihood that they will actually buy a car in a household. We also have ethnographic, which is in-depth study of members of a certain culture, in usually in their natural settings, and looks at developing theories on cultural behaviors. And therefore, this uses more of also qualitative and try to observe and understand how certain cultures operate. We have experimental, which is usually objective um, and systematic. Um, Objective, systematic, and usually done in a controlled in a controlled way. Usually again used to determine causal effect. In fact, we have those pure social experiments, such as randomized controlled trials, where um, where certain um, interventions can be done in communities, if you will, to test the outcomes, and in terms I mean, focusing on the cause-effect relationships of those variables. So the variables in this case are controlled, are selected and controlled, and these can provide knowledge on what causes what in a certain event. We have correlational research, which focuses on relationships among variables. Now, a point here to note is that this is different from experimental per se, pure experimental, because having relationship with certain variables does not uh, necessarily mean that there is a causal effect relationship. An example could be that, for instance, in a certain community, uh, there are in a certain community uh, there is a project uh, on road construction. Now, if there is a project on road construction, it means that there is influx of workers in a certain community. And usually where such workers settle, you may find that the new businesses have come up. There are even other social aspects that have come up, such as, for instance, prostitution, gender-based violence, and so. But so if one is using correlational research, they are looking for relationships, but does not necessarily mean that they will determine that the influx of external workers or road workers in a certain community specifically causes such social events that have happened. Okay, so causation does not mean correlation. That's the point here to note. We have grounded theory, which sets to discover existing problems and how persons deal with such problems. So in this case, the researcher will formulate, test, refine propositions or hypotheses, and then develop a theory. And that's what they will call the grounded theory. We also have phenomenological research, which is based on a philosophy is to study and describe lived experiences of persons. Take an example here could be, for instance, one is trying to look at migration as an aspect. Uh, for instance, in the recent, we have high influx of immigrants crossing, or asylum seekers crossing from North Africa towards Europe. Even others have died trying to cross. So one would want, for instance, to study experiences of these immigrants in Europe that migrated from North Africa. So the lived experiences could be on, for instance, the migration journeys or acculturation or integration processes. So one could determine, could ask the such immigrants about their lived experiences and during and after migrating. We have predictive prognostic research, which looks at generalizing um, analysis to predict or forecast likelihood of similar phenomenon or event to happen in the future. So providing why, how, and where answers for now and the future. So in an example, typical example here could be about, for instance, let's say a certain disease has come up in a certain community or community. Let's say they are dumping, for instance, um, uh, uh, they are not disposing their rubbish well or anything. In that case, one could study and predict that at a certain event, if such bad disposal continues, then water would get contaminated, and then people would suffer from cholera. That is a predictive kind of research. Or some can study certain volcanic mountain and say, okay, within this period, there is likelihood that this volcanic mountain will erupt at a certain point. So such predictive, or one could say, okay, if you continue eating fatty foods in the near future, you may have you may suffer from obesity and diabetes. So that kind of research. We also have classification of research by design, and I've already talked about experimental. But other than experimental, in relation to that, you have quasi-experimental or non-experimental. In quasi-experimental, you'll have a research that has some characteristics of experimental research, but all aspects do not entirely cater for internal to address internal validity. Okay, so the more you move away from experimental, the higher chances that you will not cater for internal validity. So that's very important to note. We also have cross-sectional research, which sometimes also relates to survey. The most important point to note here is that this is research that is done at a single point in time. Okay, studying of uh, more than studying several cases at a single point of time. So you go, for instance, to a community, you want to find out about their income levels and how their standard of living is. You go in the community, do collect data, go to your desk, analyze it, and the findings you get, that's 10. Now, this is different from longitudinal research, whereby more cases are studied but at different intervals of time. Okay, so that's where you find now the panel data or cohort study, panel study or cohort study. So this is the individuals or cases are the cases are studied over time following certain intervals. Okay, so it's very important to note that. We also have case studies. Case study is an intensive analysis of a single study or multiple cases um, to establish how things are happening within that particular uh, uh, case or unit of analysis in this case. Whatever case, it could be a person, household, organizational intervention, that will be your case and unit of analysis. So it's very important to note that. We also have comparative study, the comparative research studies two contrasting cases or situations or events um, to analyze the similarities and differences. And this can be done using more or less identical methods to analyze such. So, for instance, one could say, okay, we want to know how you could want to understand how different mechanisms are used to handle corruption tendencies in one country and then between one country and another. Uh, okay, so it's or how, for instance, um, election campaigns um, are, are managed, or how riots are managed in one country and another. So it's very important that you put that into consideration. We have classification or types based on uh, choice of answers to certain problems, and we have evaluation research, which I think will be more important to consider, of course, for those doing monitoring and evaluation. And evaluation research try to assess occurrences in terms of maybe social, organizational, interventional, and tries to focus on courses of action, and it specifies already certain how the researchers would be able to determine or to study certain courses of action. Then we have developmental research, which focuses on studying the designing, implementation, and evaluation processes and the outcomes. So it focuses on developing or coming up with more suitable processes or tools or products than the current ones. So this, you can also relate this to what we said earlier during applied and action research. Okay, so it's very important. So an example could be that maybe if you look at, for instance, what they do in factories when they are designing a model car, they don't just design it at once. They do test uh, they design, build, and then evaluate how it works or whether the market would like it. And then if they test, after testing that, then they can now make better ones based on the findings that they get. So that's the developmental research. We have classifications based on processes and methods that are used. So in this case, the general categories could be quantitative versus qualitative. Quantitative uses data in form of numbers and statistics and focuses on predicting, generalizing through representation. Qualitative is non-statistical, and therefore the data is in form of words, objects, symbols, and pictures, and it focuses more on understanding the complete details. So we could look at, for instance, meanings and individual perspectives. Uh, so that's qualitative. We also have types, classification based on type of data used. In this case, some researchers use, um, um, some research studies use primary data, which is collected from the field, but others use secondary data, which can be collected from literature or already existing data sets. And then one can sit and analyze. Classification can also be done in form of, in terms of field of study. So it could be natural science research, social science research, or education research. So the terminologies are based on what motivates certain research. And lastly, on classification, it could be also done, types can be classified in terms of time. So the research questions could be on what was, so that means past. So in this case, you could have historical or archival research, or what is, meaning present and now. So that would relate to the descriptive research, trying to explain what is happening. Um, uh, so for instance, the current inflation and so on, or one could study what is happening in conflicts in countries like Sudan, or between Russia and Ukraine. Or the categorization could be on what will be. So the research would be focusing on the future. So this could relate to the experimental or predictive research that we've talked about earlier. The bottom line is that research relates to this, as a concept, can be understood as search for and development of knowledge. There is no absolute definition of research, but of course we have common characteristics, as we have seen, that can give us a general picture or the general understanding of the concept of research. And we have different classifications and the types of research that are based on various motivations and focus. Yeah, so here you find resources that could help you understand more of what we've discussed. And so thank you for listening.